Hello, and welcome to Dissecting Philosophy with Dr. McDonald. In this episode, I'll be reading and discussing the section, The Shadow, in Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra. So let's get started. The Shadow. But hardly had the voluntary beggar run off, and was Zarathustra alone again, then he had heard a new voice behind him calling, "Stop, Zarathustra, wait! It is I, O Zarathustra, I, your shadow." But Zarathustra did not wait, for a sudden ill humour overcame him on account of all the crowding and thronging on his mountains. "Where has my solitude fled?" he said. "Truly, it is becoming too much for me. These mountains are swarming. My kingdom is no longer of this world. I need new mountains. Does my shadow call me? Of what account is my shadow? Let it run after me. I shall run away from it." Thus spoke Zarathustra to his heart, and ran off. But he who was behind him followed after, so that forthwith there were 3 runners, one behind the other, that is, foremost the voluntary beggar, then Zarathustra, and thirdly and hindmost his shadow. They had not been running thus for long when Zarathustra became conscious of his folly, and at once shook off his ill humour and disgust. "What," he said, "have not the most laughable things always happened with us old hermits and saints? Truly my folly has grown high in the mountains. Now I hear 6 foolish old legs clattering one behind the other. But can Zarathustra really be afraid of a shadow? And anyway, I think it has longer legs than I." Thus spoke Zarathustra, laughing with his eyes and his entrails, then stopped, and turned quickly around, and behold, in doing so, he almost threw his follower and his shadow to the ground. The latter followed so closely upon his heels, and was so weak. For when Zarathustra inspected him with his eyes, he was as terrified as if he had suddenly seen a ghost, so slight, dark, hollow, and spent did this follower appear. "Who are you?" Zarathustra asked furiously. "What are you doing here, and why do you call yourself my shadow? I do not like you." "Forgive me," answered the shadow. "That is I, and if you do not like me, very good, Zarathustra. I praise you and your good taste in that. I am a wanderer who has already walked far at your heels, always going but without a goal and without a home, so that truly I am almost the eternal wandering Jew, except that I am neither eternal nor a Jew. What, must I always be going, whirled by every wind, restless, driven onward? O earth, you have grown too round for me. I have sat on every surface, like weary dust. I have fallen asleep upon mirrors and window panes. Everything takes from me, nothing gives. I have become thin. I'm almost like a shadow." So, the shadow. And we have Zarathustra start off in this section, having run away from the voluntary beggar in the last section, and the voluntary beggar was that individual who was wealthy, and gave away his wealth in order to try and have people love him and think highly of him because of having given away his wealth. That in and of itself is just an action he wanted to be praised for, and the people didn't accept him at all, didn't think highly of him at all. And then we had that nice discussion about how with the loss of God, we had then the poor wanting to seek wealth for themselves. No longer are the poor blessed anymore. And on the other hand, we also have the idea of the wealthy as looking down upon the poor. And at the end of the last section, we had that nice relation into Epicureanism and only seeking what's natural and necessary, because the mountain man or the voluntary beggar is one that was wanting to seek a simple life living with cows. And then along came Zarathustra, and suddenly Zarathustra was very much appealing to him. And so then we have the voluntary beggar chase after Zarathustra at the start of the next section. And then at the same time, we have the next character that we're going to bump into that suddenly just appears from almost out of nowhere, and that is the shadow. And it's kind of strange here because you've got to kind of read a little bit more into it as it's going along, because it initially says it's his shadow, but then as it goes along it says in fact that it's actually a wanderer. And so we have then both the voluntary beggar, Zarathustra, and this wanderer all sort of in motion, whilst as Zarathustra is trying to run away from both the voluntary beggar and this wanderer character. And then he suddenly just stops and turns around to confront the wanderer. And then, rounding off the first little part here, we have the reasons for why this wanderer has found Zarathustra and is wanting to become attached to Zarathustra, very much like the voluntary beggar here, because the wanderer is without a goal and without a home, and hopes that Zarathustra's view will ground him in some way and give him direction and a goal for his life. And one of the main things that comes out of this is a key question of why run? Why does Zarathustra have the need to run and run away from the voluntary beggar and from this wanderer? Why doesn't he just stop and allow them to come to him and praise him, and Zarathustra just continue on along his way? And we get a slight bit of an answer if we dig deeper into this sentence. When he suddenly then stops running, he says, "What?" he said, "have not the most laughable things always happened with us old hermits and saints?" And it's that point. Isn't it laughable what I'm doing here? Isn't it just a nice big joke? And it goes in more to say here, well, why chase after someone in the first place? Why not then try to develop out who you are as a person? Why latch on to Zarathustra? And why have that feel the need for someone else to give you all the answers? Because that's one of the key points about this whole thing, of course, is other people in their lives, of course, will have discovered things for themselves, reached ideas and opinions about certain things. And when we're in the midst of curiosity and discovering things, or in a state where we're trying to find meaning for ourselves or value for ourselves, we can be very much swayed by someone else's opinion and what they think. And so much so that you're swept up in it, and you're like, let's use a good image here, like a boat swept out to sea. You're just completely caught up adrift in the other person. But that's, of course, following on from last episode, not what we want here. And it sort of makes Zarathustra as a character different from how you would treat prophets as well. And going back into that whole idea of, well, how do we think of prophecies and soothsayers? We treat them always with that pinch of salt. We never really say, well, Nostradamus, for instance, do we take those revelations to be something absolutely certain? No, because it's always that refrain from it. In the same instance here, we can say, well, people are not hesitant in the way that they should be with opinions. There's not a refrain that's necessary. There's not that step back and critical thinking for oneself that's necessary, because, like the last episode, we had that whole set up with Socrates and Plato. Plato being incredibly enamored, in love with his teacher. You get this very beautiful picture created by Plato of Socrates, where ultimately they sent a man who's a great thinker to his death. How dare they? That's more else the picture that you get out of Plato when you look at Socrates. But then, do we want people to be held up in such a way? In fact, isn't all knowledge, isn't all opinions in some way, even if they are held up, can they not just kind of be really funny and just be made a joke of? And it's that whole point of, well, at a given time period, of course, and this has come up again in previous episodes, we think it's absolutely fantastic. And we think there's nothing better than this idea, but it's all very much a temporary thing, because knowledge itself can change. And so Zarathustra himself is a character that is not trying to advocate any grand ideals in the same way that it's follow me, if you follow my opinions, then you'll be okay. And that's normally what philosophy does. These big, massive egos that philosophers have. I have the method, I have the way, I'll go construct this, and if you follow this, you'll get out of all the problems that I've identified. Zarathustra's more in the line of, well, I'm only going to start to show you the problems, and then you're going to have to try and work your way out of them for yourselves. So it's that whole move from not entirely focusing on what are the answers, because the answers, of course, have the problem of the only answer and the only way. And of course, that's not what Nietzsche wants. Nietzsche always wants that openness. And specifically for his style as well, we can see sometimes frustratingly that it's written in such a way that you have to really think hard about what it says. And it's not just given to you. And it's that whole point of, it's that openness and making you think on a deep level, in a deep way, about things. And interestingly enough, this whole idea of thinking deeply and critically upon things, we have also the section, The Wanderer and His Shadow, from Human All Too Human as well. And so, taking a little detour from Zarathustra to Human All Too Human for a moment here, we have a wanderer have a conversation with his shadow. that's happened, of course, before in a completely different book. And so, in this section that we have from Human All Too Human, initially you have the wanderer surprised because his shadow talks to him. Because, of course, everybody would be surprised if suddenly their shadow talked to them. But then we have that relation a little bit into vanity. I thought my shadow was meant to be an image of me in such a way that it represents who I am. And so we have that nice relation into egoism that sort of comes out of it. Your copy of you, basically the image that you project onto society, is going to be a reflection of who you are as a person. And so you would expect that to be, of course, not the real you. It would be your copy or your shadow. And so that would go back into the section Conversation with the Kings, because in that section we had that whole idea of people are not genuinely who they are. They're always this false image or shadow that's always projected onto others. And then with the Conversation with the Kings, people were trying to appease the kings, say whatever they wanted to hear, and not giving their genuine opinion about things. And then as it develops on in Human All Too Human, for this section, The Wanderer and His Shadow, it then starts to talk about how shadows are necessary when we think of ideas, and it gives a really great example when we think about art. As it says here, now I see for the first time how rude I am to you, my beloved shadow. I have not said a word of my supreme delight in hearing and not merely seeing you. You must know that I love shadows even as I love light, for the existence of a beautiful face, clearness of speech, kindliness and firmness of character, the shadow is as necessary as the light. They are not opponents, rather do they hold each other's hands like good friends, and when the light vanishes, the shadow glides after it. And then the shadow replies, yes, and I hate the same thing that you hate, night. I love men because they are votaries of life. I rejoice in the gleam of their eyes when they recognize and discover, they who are never weary of recognizing and discovering, that shadow which all things cast when the sunshine of knowledge falls upon them. That shadow too am I. And so what it's saying there, going back into the relation for art, let's just have a portrait as an example, and we try to paint a face as you do in portraiture. So if you tried to, let's say, Photoshop someone's face to make it look as perfect as physically possible, to remove all blemishes and imperfections and wrinkles, you would ultimately not only not represent the person for as they actually are, you also take away the realness of that person's face. It becomes just this sort of pure idyllic image. And so one of the key things that we get out of this, in the importance of the shadow it's saying here, is that precisely it's all the blemishes and imperfections that make up the face, in this instance, that are as necessary to it when you're, of course, drawing it or painting it in the first place. Without those, it wouldn't look real. It would look just purely idealistic. And It's precisely all those wrinkles, creases in the skin, and so forth when you're drawing them that add that element of humanity to what you're drawing. It's all those little things that makes it more human. And so that is quite interesting when we get into the whole deeper aspects of precisely the ideas of Photoshop, because then you could say, well, you're taking all the humanity away from a person by extending the size of their body to make their body longer, legs longer, get rid of wrinkles and so on. And so from that we have in this section, Inhuman All Too Human, a really nice relation into how precisely, as he says there, the shadow is as necessary as what the light is. Then, of course, when we go into art and drawing and you deal with light and shadow also, that's equally as important at the same time, because it adds that whole element of realism again back into whatever you're drawing or painting. And then this section, The Wanderer and His Shadow, rounds off with a discussion about the nature of the conversation that they're having, which has taken place in a dialogue, which is between both the wanderer and his shadow going back and forth. And then it makes the relation into Plato, because that's how Plato also wrote, was in a form of dialogues between Socrates and a group of people that was talking to Socrates. And it says here, for the shadow speaking first, shadows are more shy than men. You will not reveal to any man the manner of our conversation. Then the wanderer says, the manner of our conversation, heaven preserve me from wire-drawn literary dialogues. If Plato had found less pleasure in spinning them out, his readers would have found more pleasure in Plato. A dialogue that in real life is a source of delight, when turned into writing and read, is a picture with nothing but false perspectives. Everything is too long or too short. Yet perhaps I may reveal the points on which we have come to an understanding. And so the key thing to take out of this part of it is that line of it's nothing but false perspectives. And going back into Plato, what we have in Plato is Socrates always winning the conversation. Socrates, because he's so much loved by Plato as a great teacher, he's never wrong or incorrect in his thinking. And so what will always happen is that regardless whatever subject that they're talking about, and regardless whoever it is that's talking, Socrates will be always the one to win the conversation. And so you may think to yourself, well, what about the other people? Are they making bad arguments? Because surely we can just brush them aside if Socrates is able to get rid of them so easily. And that's one of the good points that you can go back to in reading Plato, is go back to the other people that were talking, and actually you can defend what they're saying. And they're not quite so easily at times brushed aside for an argument, because they make really good points. But this is also making the point that Nietzsche's highlighting to us here, is that who is writing these things is someone who's going to be skewing the argument towards a specific viewpoint and precisely trying to get rid of everything else that doesn't fit in with what they want to argue for. And so what you end up with is a bunch of false perspectives, false views, going towards the only true one, which would be Socrates' view. And so then it rounds off with, have we come to an understanding? And of course, ironically, they don't really come to an understanding at the end of Wanderer and His Shadow. It's sort of making fun of the fact that whenever we do come to an understanding, there's always that element of it's never concrete, it's never perfect. There's always that flaw in it. There's always that element that it can be false. Yet we always like to think we're so certain and have firm belief in absolute certainty in things. And so then, as a roundabout way of coming back into this section for the shadow, in Zarathustra then, we have this wanderer then is representing the previous idea in the section in Human All Too Human, the wanderer and his shadow, as that sense of uncertainty that we have. And this uncertainty is when we have a loss of meaning or value because we've then saw it no longer to be true anymore, but in fact is false, or doesn't have the same worth anymore. And so the posh term for this moment in which value and meaning is lost to us is called an existential crisis. And a good example of this would be when someone has that moment in their life and then suddenly something that did have value and meaning suddenly is completely lost. And let's use the example of going to specific work every single day. Initially, incredibly exciting. You have lovely honeymoon sort of period with your work, but then over time it starts to become a grind, as they say, becomes tedious. You start to question why you're there in the first place, and then in doing so you're then starting to question the very value, meaning and worth of precisely that job to you. You make it go into crisis. And that, of course, can be built up over a course of several days, several weeks, or even years, as somebody then starts to question moving on to a different job, moving on to a different location, and so on, all causing those potential big shifts in someone's life. And so we have this then with the wanderer in Zarathustra, because he suddenly lost his goal and is so desperate to seek a path back in life's way that he wants to get himself attached onto Zarathustra's way. So let's continue on with the wanderer, and we'll be going more into this whole idea of this existential crisis that he's got himself into. But I have fled to you and followed you longest, O Zarathustra, and although I have hidden myself from you, yet I was your best shadow. Where you have sat, there I sat too. I have travelled with you in the remotest, coldest worlds, like a ghost that voluntarily walks over snow and winter roofs. I have striven with you into all that was forbidden, worst, most remote, and if anything in me be a virtue, it is that I have feared no prohibition. I have broken up with you whatever my heart revered. I have overthrown boundary stones and statues. I have pursued the most dangerous desires. Truly, I once went beyond every crime. I have unlearned with you belief in words and values and great names. When the devil casts his skin, does his name not also fall away? For that too is a skin. The devil himself is, perhaps, a skin. Nothing is true, everything is permitted. Thus I told myself. I plunged into the coldest water with head and heart. Alas, how often I stood naked, like a red crab on that account. Alas, Where have all my goodness and shame and belief in the good fled? Alas, where is that mendacious innocence that I once possessed? The innocence of the good and their noble lies. Truly, too often did I follow close by the feet of truth, then it kicked me in the face. Sometimes I intended to lie, and behold, only then did I hit the truth. Too much has become clear to me now. Now I am no longer concerned with it. No longer is there anything living that I love. How should I still love myself? To live as I desire to live, or not to live at all, that is what I want. That is what the most saintly man wants. But alas, how can I still have a desire? Have I still a goal? A haven to which my sail races? A good wind? Alas, only he who knows where he is going knows which wind is a good and fair wind for him. What is left to me? A heart weary and insolent, a restless will, infirm wings, a broken backbone. This seeking for my home, O Zarathustra, do you know this seeking was my affliction? It is consuming me. Where is my home? I ask and seek, and have sought for it. I have not found it. O eternal everywhere, O eternal nowhere, O eternal vanity. Thus spoke the shadow, and Zarathustra's face lengthened at his words. You are my shadow, he said at length, sorrowfully. Your danger is no small one, you free spirit and wanderer. You have a bad day. See, you do not have a worse evening. Even a prison at last seems bliss to such restless people as you. Have you ever seen how captured criminals sleep? They sleep peacefully. They enjoy their new security. Take care that you are not at last captured by a narrow belief, a hard, stern illusion. For henceforth everything that is narrow and firm will entice and tempt you. You have lost your goal. Alas, how will you get over and laugh away that loss? By losing your goal, you have lost your way too. You poor traveller, wanderer, you weary butterfly, would you this evening have a resting place and homestead? So go up to my cave. Yonder leads the way to my cave. And now I will run quickly away from you again. Already it is as if a shadow were lying upon me. I will run alone, so that it may again grow bright around me. For that I still have a long time merrily on my legs. In the evening, however, we shall dance. Thus spoke Zarathustra. We have the wanderer then continue on and give us a nice detailed description of this crisis that he's in at present. So we have then initially the wanderer say about how he followed Zarathustra, and then from Zarathustra he's unlearned belief in words, values, and great names. And why is that the case? Because everything is like a skin that can fall off. So the example that's given here is like a red crab. But also other crustaceans would be good examples, like a lobster, who is, of course has a shell on, that then you eat the lobster, you take apart the shell and get to the actual lobster itself. And another example that we can use is, of course, like a snake coming out of its skin. But in both instances, we have that nice relation, again, back into the conversation with the kings, of this idea of a skin or a shell that's sort of worn by people in order to perform for others. and we get dressed up in order to impress others. We precisely dress a certain way, behave a certain way, act a certain way in order for other people to accept us, as well as what we say is also what they want to hear. So all these acting and performance-like qualities coming out here again. But now the Wanderer is saying, well, Zarathustra, you've enabled me precisely to get rid of this shell and get rid of this skin, and I can stand as you would do, naked without it. But in doing so, he's hit upon this existential crisis with meaning, and suddenly there is no meaning, value, or worth to anything anymore. And let's for a moment dig a little deeper into this. Why would there be such an existential crisis? Is because also we're at the point of part 4 here, where there's this nice sort of reflection upon this state where people have accepted in the future that God is dead. So, as we've had in the previous section, retired from service, we had the priest who was looking for the last pious person because everyone had accepted God as dead. Now, for the shadow, we have the Wanderer as a character who is accepting very much of this idea. You can see, because God provides that solid foundation for things, for our knowledge is a concrete form. But once you get rid of that, suddenly there's that crisis. Suddenly, what is value, meaning anymore? How am I meant to live my life? And this is, of course, one of the deep questions out of it, and one of the big sort of philosophical, ethical problems, as well as if you say God is dead, then where is ethics? How exactly are you meant to live your life? And from that, we get nicely into the initial first reactions that the Wanderer has. When there is that whole acceptance of God is dead and the loss of meaning, he suddenly then says, nothing is true, everything is permitted. And so he then has this chaotic moment. Or, as a good example that's also popped up in previous episodes, this sort of punk rock sort of mentality, attitude towards things, where suddenly there is no value, there is no worth in anything anymore. I can just go out and live my life however I want to go live it. And of course, incredibly destructive as an attitude, because you can be saying, well, suddenly then that would affirm me just being an alcoholic, for instance. What would stop me from just going into that lifestyle? And then it hits upon again the idea of truth. Certain truths are upheld but then are shown to be false. What am I meant to believe in if nothing is stable? And we come up with those couple of beautiful lines, really. As it says here, too much has become clear to me now. Now I am no longer concerned with it. No longer is there anything living that I love. How should I still love myself? To live as I desire to live, or not to live at all. That is what I want. That is what the most saintly man wants. But alas, how can I still have a desire? And what's so beautiful about this is the fact is this acceptance of a care for oneself and love for oneself and wanting to find that. So it's this idea of a sense of, well, there is a whole destruction and destructive mentality, let's say, with this whole existential crisis that the wanderer's in. How can I find meaning anymore? With no meaning, ultimately, I could go find or do whatever it is that I like. Nothing is true. Everything is permitted, as he says. But within that, there's that sort of realization at the same time that you want to also love and care for your own well-being at the same time as that. That is, yes, everything technically would be permitted, but at the same time, would you want to do that to yourself? And the man's clearly thinking here, no, I wouldn't want to. Because he's in that whole process of seeking another thing that's going to be beneficial for him. And so, what's great here as an example is precisely also dealing with the psychology and sort of psychological aspects of depression at the same time. Because you can say here, with the wanderer, there's this whole aspect of depression that comes in the midst of what he's saying at the same time. Nothing has any value for me anymore. How can I love myself? You can see the very depressive nature and the mentality that this character has. But at the same time, also this wanting to come out of it and seeking for a way that's beneficial and helpful for them to try and come out of this state. And then that's the problem. Not knowing where to go, what home to go to, where is my home, as he says. That's become the affliction. How am I to go to any specific lifestyle choice from here? And then we have Zarathustra's response, which is quite brief. Your danger is no small one, you free spirit and wanderer. You've had a bad day, see you do not have a worse evening. And then we have, even a prison at last seems bliss to such restless people as you. Have you ever seen how captured criminals sleep? They sleep peacefully, they enjoy their new security. Take care you are not last captured by a narrow belief, a hard, stern illusion, for henceforth everything that is narrow and firm will entice and tempt you. So here we have Zarathustra really emphasize the whole positive aspects of this state of crisis, which to the wanderer, he's really been beating himself up about it, as you could say. But here, Zarathustra's more trying to make him think about the positive nature of this. Because you've seen through a certain truth as being false, or, in terms of lifestyle, because at this moment in time, that the job no longer works for you, for instance, there is that whole moment of trying to then discover what to do next. But that whole act of discovery and seeking is not something to be looked down upon or to beat yourself up about, but rather is a very joyful, pleasant experience because it allows for that progress to happen. Within, let's take knowledge as an example, once we realize that precisely an idea can be challenged, then it opens the door for a different idea or hypothesis to take its place. Or to use the job example, is that whole process of moving on is a very positive thing because it again opens the doors for you to progress within your life at the same time. But what you shouldn't do, as he says, to highlight a little red flag, is to try and then narrow yourself down and limit yourself down like you were before, and always be open to possibilities and different ways of doing things, because there's going to be so many different things that are going to try and entice you and tempt you, and you shouldn't be taken with that. And then we have, rounding off the section, Zarathustra saying to the wanderer to come up to his cave, and in the evening we'll all have a nice dance. And so we can say overall for the section The Shadow then is really building upon this whole idea of the death of God. With the death of God, we hit into an existential crisis for meaning. From that, we can get into the whole psychological aspects of depression, really beating ourselves up about the whole loss of meaning, value, worth to things. But at the same time, we have Zarathustra very much remind us about the positive aspects of that crisis. Yes, it is a crisis, and at a given point, we may think there's absolutely no other way of doing things, we're never going to get out of it. But it's all a positive process that enables us to move on. And we've had great examples, not only with knowledge, once it's proven to be false, or we can challenge it, then that allows that precisely to move on and progress. And also with our lives, as I keep going back into the examples of from people's work, when they move on from one job into another, then that's very much a whole progressive thing that somebody can do. And so that about wraps up the discussion on this section, The Shadow. In the next episode, we continue on the discussion with the section At Noontide. Many thanks for listening to the episode. I hope you enjoyed my discussion of the section The Shadow in Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Feel free to check out my Patreon page at patreon.com/Dissecting Philosophy. Feel free to drop me an email at my address, dissectingphilosophy@gmail.com. Tip me a coffee at ko-fi.com/Dissecting Philosophy, and I can be also found on Twitter at I am a Rubberman. Many thanks for listening, and I hope you'll join me next time.